Bom dia. First of all, I want to thank Bernard Scher and Isabel Barros to allow me to have this academic experience as a chair. I will do my best. So, in this panel, we will discuss the after-abolition legacies of slavery and new challenges in the 20th century through three presentations. To open this panel, we have Michael's Schmitz presentation, Capital, Race and Labor in Swiss-Brazilian company Wildberger. We pronounce like this, Wildberger. And CIA Cacao business in the south of Bahia, first half of the 20th century. Michael Schmitz will present some of the reflection that he's making in his PhD thesis, which is supervised by one of these conference organizers, Bernard Scher, here at the University of Lausanne. He's also a member of the collaborative history of global history in the 19th century.
Okay. Oh, wow. Et vous avez isso. Okay. Okay. And it's this one, huh? Okay, good. Okay. Dear audience, first of all, thanks to Isabel and Bernhard for the invitation and opportunity to present here. I'm really proud to be a member of this team and to be at this conference. So on February 12th, 1943, just a few months before the regime of the dictator Getúlio Vargas nationalized cacao exports in the hands of the Bahia Cacao Institute, an astonishing appeal appeared in Bahia's most important newspaper, A Tarde. An appeal from cacao farmers to a major exporting company. The telegram sent by numerous farmers requesting Wildberger and Company to continue its trade reverberated throughout the cacao region. In response, the firm, recalling that it had been exporting cacao since 1892 and pointing to the investments of huge amounts of capital employed and spread across 2,000 customers, declared that it had recently reduced its purchases to 460,000 bags, down from 700,000 bags. As a result of this and the threat of the exporters' exclusion, the firm is forced to withdraw from its business. The cacao rots in the interior of the state because the new beneficiaries of export quotas are not in a position to purchase it. This appeal illustrates the extent of control that Swiss-Brazilian merchants Wildberger exercised over the Bahian cacao market in the mid-20th century. It shows also the basis of this control, a wide-ranging network of cacao suppliers established since the very beginning of the cacao boom, and the capacity to secure huge amounts of capital to sustain this network. Wildberger & Co. was established under this name in 1993 by Swiss merchant Emil Wildberger. Oh, there's a problem here. Okay, yes. It was Bahia's by far largest cacao exporter from the 1920s to the 40s, with a record market share of 36% in 1929. By providing agricultural credit, Wildberger was one of the main promoters of cacao monoculture and export economy in Bahia. From 1936, it was also one of Bahia's largest cacao producers through the Companhia Agrícola Cacaoeira. Swiss chocolate manufacturers were among Wildberger's clients, but overall the US market was much more important for Bahia and Wildberger since World War I. So I have to go back, sorry. Bahia's cacao monoculture developed in the south of the state since the 1870s in correlation with the exploding demand for cacao from the emerging chocolate industry. A prerequisite for this expansion was the violent expulsion of the local indigenous population. Bahia's economy depended highly on cacao in the 20th century. The export tax on cacao alone accounted for around 27% of the state revenues in the 1920s. For most of the century, Bahia was the world's second largest cacao producer worldwide, mostly behind Gold Coast, now Ghana, with a market share of roughly 10 to 20% of the world market. Many scholars have emphasized that Wildberger was a significant actor in 20th century Swiss-Brazilian history for some time. However, due to lack of sources, they had to rely almost exclusively on the works of family historian Arnold Wildberger. But this has changed recently for my ongoing PhD project. This guy here, Ricardo Wildberger Lisboa, he's a descendant, has generally granted me access to the company's archives. They are now open to historical research for the first time and are the main archive for my PhD project. The sources include correspondence, minutes, and balances. Other important sources include judicial files from Bahia State Archives, files of the Swiss consulate in Bahia, in the Swiss Federal Archives Bern, and various other public-private archives in Brazil and Switzerland. My overarching research question is, how did Wildberger and company structurally integrate Bahia into the capitalist world market of cacao? I will not read these aspects now, for a matter of time. My research is thus a contribution to Brazilian and Swiss historiographies and the historiographies of global commodity trade. Today, I will concentrate on the question to what extent this integration was shaped by Bahia's colonial and slavery heritage. The first aspect is capital. Now sorry. Yeah, capital accumulated in the slavery-based economy of the 19th century was crucial for Wildberger's commercial success. Wildberger and Company was actually founded in 1829 as Ziegler brothers and Trümpi, who appeared on a slide yesterday in Andreas Zanker's presentation. Few years after Brazil's independence in 1822-3. It imported and exported a variety of goods and enjoyed a close business relationship with Swiss plantation owners Gabriel von May and Ferdinand von Steiger from the mostly cacao and coffee plantation Victoria in Ilhéus, on which we heard a lot yesterday. Sorry. Sources indicate that the company was also involved in the trading of enslaved people, at least in the context of this business relationship. In 1836, Jean-Joachim Keller, son of a baker from a small town in eastern Switzerland, joined the company. When he returned to Switzerland 26 years later, he was married to a daughter of the highest bourgeoisie in the emerging commercial industrial city of Winterthur, and by the time of his death in 1885, he was one of its wealthiest citizens. This is a clear indication of the company's early standing and profitability. Under Jean-Joachim's son Carlos, this company, now CF Keller Company, was the first to purchase cacao directly in the production region and export it. Emil Wildberger moved to Bahia in 1892, 4 years after abolition, and took over Keller's Bahian business at the beginning of the 20th century. Based in Paris since 1883, Keller became a limited partner and general agent for Europe when Wildberger was founded, when the company was founded. Thus, capital from the era of slavery played a significant role in the formation of Wildberger Company. The afterlife of the company lasts well into present times with Swiss-Brazilian billionaire Jorge Paulo Lehmann, owner of the food and beverage companies Anheuser-Busch, Kraft Heinz, and Burger King, among others. Jorge Paulo's father, Swiss cheese merchant Paul Lehmann, immigrated to Brazil, married the daughter of Wildberger partner Louis Trübner, and became a director and shareholder of Wildberger's plantation company. So why capital was needed? Because setting up a cacao plantation doesn't require a lot of capital. Production is extensive and technologically simple. However, there is no income during the first 3 to 4 years when the cacao tree does not bear fruit. Additionally, the dead season between harvests must be bridged. Furthermore, cacao production was dominated by rural oligarchs, some of them from old slave-owning families of the state or the region. As in other regions of Brazil, they were called coronéis because they often held a post in the National Guard. These cordonniers needed money not only for their agricultural production, but also to finance clientelistic networks and maintain a representative bourgeois lifestyle in their main residences, which were often in Salvador da Bahia and Rio. The many small landowners, often migrants from the state of Sergipe or other parts of Bahia, among them many Afro-Brazilians, normally didn't have access to credit by exporters. Often they were indebted to the larger plantation owners and ended up losing their plantations to them. Together with the legal frauds and the violence employed by the cordonniers, this resulted in a land concentration unique among the main cacao producing areas in the 20th century. Wildberger's loans were dispersed through agencies and branches in the cacao region. Okay. The main credit tool was advances on cacao deliveries. These became increasingly detached from the concrete necessities of the cacao business, at least among important suppliers. An important plantation owner in Belmonte had unlimited credit with Wildberger's agents for some time. In this way, Wildberger financed not only cacao production, but also the rural oligarchs' power system. Wildberger's main lenders were European banks and US banks. However, until at least at the end of the 1930s, there was also a very strong dependence on loans by limited partner C.F. Keller. Thus, through credit, capital originating from the era of slavery sustained also Wildberger's market power in the cacao region. How was Wildberger's position in the global cacao trade compared to its 19th century predecessors? Trümpi, Jetzler, and Keller, the predecessors, all lived transimperial lives between Brazil, Switzerland, France, or Germany. Most of them returned to Europe after some time. Back there, their father and son Keller held important positions in the bourgeoisie. Until the end of World War I, Emil Wildberger was also strongly involved with interests of European powers, mainly through his connections to French banks and as a Swiss honorary consul. He retained this post until his death in 1946, but his French connections disappeared in the 1920s. Wildberger's business was geographically fixed to Bahia. His access to European US capital markets enabled its dominant position in the state's cacao's economy, but made him also dependent on his financiers. With the Great Depression in the 1930s, Wildberger's credit system suffered a huge crisis. Agencies and plantation owners were highly indebted. Wildberger's dependence on loans from Keller led to significant pressure, which was then passed on the agencies and ultimately to the plantation owners. We can see this in this message from Emil Wildberger to his agent Belmonte. We will now have to prepare ourselves for a considerable reduction in our Paris credit. That means the Keller credit. We have no choice but to take action against our agencies with the utmost severity. If we are pressured, we have no choice but to respond in kind. As a result, many suppliers, including prominent members of the cacao elite, had to hand over their plantations to the company as a partial debt payment. Speaking about coffee trade, Topic observes that since the last quarter of the 19th century, the balance of power had shifted from the exporters to the importers, partly because of the telegraph that had hugely improved the latter's access to information. There are several indications that the different careers of Wildberger and his predecessors that I have described in this part are related to a similar shift. Technological change certainly influenced the cacao trade as well. Furthermore, few large conglomerates dominated the 20th century chocolate production and were able to control the trade through their significant market power. Whether abolition of slavery also reduced or contributed to this power shift, in what extent I will still have to clarify. Thus, on a global scale, Wildberger had the role of an intermediary. It was subordinate to European and US capital, but still allowed to accumulate considerable profits, huge profits, and to shape the history of a region profoundly. To be able to foster Bahia's integration into the global cacao market, Wildberger had in turn to integrate into the state's post-abolition society. Key to these were marriage strategies. In 1897, just 5 years after his arrival in Bahia, Emil Wildberger, this artisan son from a rural town in Bahia, in Schaffhausen, married Adelia Urpia from one of the most respected families of Bahian bourgeoisie. Of course, this can be understood only in the context of the dominant ideology of whitening the Brazilian population through European immigration. The Wildberger representatives' attitude towards the non-white majority population was in line with the thinking of the time. Bahia's society and economy were deeply racialized, as these photos from the collection of Carlos F. Keller's son, Philip, demonstrate. Manual workers in the cacao economy were almost exclusively non-white, including many women and children. In contrast, all key positions at Wildberger, apart from the lawyer, were held by Swiss nationals. The lawyer was from the Gissa family, by the way. In the this collection, we see also pictures that are in the tradition of colonial photography, reproducing situations of dominance and invisibilized violence. I think it's clear what it depicts, so I will go on here. Okay, for a matter of time. When they appear at all, the cacao workers are portrayed in the Wildberger correspondence either as incapable of calculating expenses in the plantation store, as demanding in terms of wages, or as quote-unquote irresponsible blacks whose statements cannot be used in official proceedings. But typical of Brazilian race relations, these negative attitudes towards the black population did not preclude Wildberger from forming alliances with the few Afro-Brazilians in the cacao elite. Afro-Brazilian plantation owner Basilio da Silva Carneiro from Canavieiras was a long-time Wildberger business partner. Wildberger successfully advocated for Carneiro to receive a National Guard title in 1907 to strengthen his standing among the local cacao elite. According to family memory, Carneiro's face was artificially whitened in this official National Guard photo. To what extent were labor relations in Wildberger's cacao business shaped by the heritage of slavery? After abolition, working and living conditions for the mostly migrant cacao workers continued to be dire. Wages were barely enough to live on, and workers had to buy groceries normally in the plantation store at excessive prices, which resulted in debt bondage, widespread debt bondage, we have to say. Okay, I have one page. Okay. A plantation owner only since the 1930s debt crisis, Wildberger presented itself as a modernizer that built schools on some model plantation, provided medical care, and took out accident insurance for his workers. Bahia's press praised the company as a pioneer of social progress. After the introduction of statutory minimum wage in 1939, Wildberger applied it on its plantations. However, the minimum wage was set low and did not apply to the widespread form of contract labor. In promoting limited social progress, the company was again well within the spirit of the times. The ideology of the Vargas regime that ruled Brazil since 1930 promoted nationalism, social policies, and modernization under authoritarian leadership. The main motivation for strictly complying with the new social legislation was to avoid provoking state reprisals as a foreign export company. The schools can be seen as a contribution to Vargas's modernization project and nation-building project, as in Wildberger's words, cells of national development. Well, in conclusion, despite the significant changes since the 19th century, this heritage of colonialism and slavery shaped Wildberger's trajectory significantly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael Schmitz. In the next presentation, we will continue to discuss the cocoa labor in the Bahia in the 20th century issues with Kátia Vinhatico Pontes' presentation. Cocoa and labor in the Post-Abolition South of Bahia 20th century. So, Kátia Vinhatico Pontes is a professor at the State University of Santa Cruz in Bahia, where she works, among other subjects, in the Atlantic history and the African diaspora. She develops research in the fields of social and economic history with an emphasis on the Cacao trajectories, ethnic-racial relations, and anti-racism. She is also a member of the research group Ports and Cities in the Atlantic World at the Fluminense Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. So, Kátia, the floor is yours. Sim, sim.
Prezados colegas, agradeço à Universidade de Lausanne. Está aqui?
Não, peraí, mas não foi.
Prezados colegas.
Deu?
Ok? Vocês estão me ouvindo bem? E a pessoa que está traduzindo também está ouvindo bem?
Está ouvindo bem? Tá.
A mudança dos slides está aqui. Ok. Sim, sim.
Deu?
Aos coordenadores Bernard Chá, Isabel Barros e a Michael Schmitz, pelo convite para essa conferência, que aprofunda e fortalece a pesquisa histórica sobre as relações entre a Suíça e o Brasil. Sou natural de Itabuna, cidade do sul da Bahia. Eu trouxe um mapa para mostrar em vermelho a Ilhéus e ao lado Itabuna, que juntamente com Ilhéus lidera a região cacaueira. Desde 2012, analiso a construção em Ilhéus, no início do século XX, de uma estrada de ferro inglesa, subsidiada pelo governo do estado da Bahia, e a construção de um porto por capitais regionais e nacionais sob hegemonia inglesa. Essa investigação resultou na minha tese de doutorado intitulada O binômio Porto-Ferrovia, o escoamento da produção cacaueira no sul da Bahia, de 1920 a 1947, na qual discuti os impactos das transformações da infraestrutura de transportes. No final do século XIX e início do século XX, foram 3 os setores da economia regional que foram diretamente impactados pela atuação de agentes capitalistas e capitais estrangeiros. A produção, financiamento e exportação do cacau pelos suíços, a infraestrutura de transportes, porto e ferrovia pelos ingleses e a navegação internacional pelos suecos. Pesquisamos os impactos desses capitais em disputa na história da região. Atualmente, desenvolvo o projeto de pesquisa O Cacau no Atlântico, Produção, Circulação e Consumo, a partir do sul da Bahia, entre 1890 a 2000. O objetivo desse projeto é consolidar um grupo de pesquisa voltado para o estudo das relações capitalistas em suas conexões atlânticas, a partir das perspectivas dos campos da história do Atlântico e da diáspora africana. Os principais conceitos teóricos mobilizados são Economia Mundo, de Fernand Braudel, e Sistema Mundo, de Immanuel Wallenstein, considerando suas implicações geográficas, econômicas e étnicas. Os marcos cronológicos se justificam porque, nessa temporalidade mais ampla, a perspectiva histórica permite analisar de forma mais abrangente as dinâmicas, contradições e transformações estruturais na trajetória da monocultura cacaueira. A preocupação central do projeto é analisar os impactos na sociedade dos modelos econômicos de desenvolvimento implantados no Brasil e suas implicações. É importante iniciar... Eu queria um pouquinho de água. Desculpem, beber água. Ai, a gente fica nervoso. É importante iniciar indagando ao presente por que pesquisar o período pós-abolição no sul da Bahia. Ah, que bom.
Just take your time, okay? No need to be,
A partir da década de 1980, o neoliberalismo difundiu a desregulamentação das relações econômicas, a fragilização das instituições estatais de regulação e controle, o aumento da competição e, como consequência, a ampliação das assimetrias sociais, fragilizando ainda mais as relações de trabalho. Assim, como não estabelecer paralelos com situações análogas vividas no final do século XIX e início do XX, quando o Brasil enfrentou uma severa crise decorrente da falta de regulamentação, da intensa competição e do imperialismo das grandes potências internacionais. Processos como esse forçaram a alteração das relações de produção, a reorganização da logística de transporte e a transformação do regime de trabalho com a substituição da mão de obra escrava pela mão de obra livre. Bom, farei um breve esboço sobre a trajetória da produção do cacau no sul da Bahia, algumas considerações sobre a formação da classe dominante regional, destacando a inserção dos suíços nesse processo, e, finalmente, sobre a formação da classe trabalhadora após a abolição da escravidão. Parafraseando Flávio Santos, é um professor da Bahia, cada porto importou. Cada um deles foi essencial na construção do capitalismo em sua fase imperialista. No século XIX, pequenos portos ganharam relevância como espaço de experimentação das relações capitalistas, das práticas comerciais e das disputas por rotas, territórios e produtos. Ilhéus foi um destes. Ilhéus tem porto. É uma cidade da costa atlântica brasileira, situada no sul do estado da Bahia, a cerca de 450 quilômetros da capital Salvador. Possui uma característica historicamente marcante. É geopoliticamente estratégica para a navegação, devido à sua localização litorânea entre Salvador e Rio de Janeiro, o que a gente pode ver no mapa. Com origem no século XVI, a vila da sede colonial da capitania de São Jorge dos Ilhéus era ocupada até o século XVIII por povos indígenas e uma presença esparsa de colonizadores. Em novembro de 1808, o rei português Dom João VI expediu o decreto... Ai, não estou conseguindo respirar, espera aí. Não é nervoso, é só o ar mesmo. Em novembro de 1808, o rei português Dom João VI expediu o decreto permitindo a concessão de terras a estrangeiros para ampliar a ocupação e a produção agrícola. Apesar dos resultados limitados, essa política estimulou o interesse na imigração voltada à formação de colônias agrícolas, uma vez que a posse das terras primárias representava um grande atrativo. Ilhéus era considerada uma fronteira agrícola. Alemães, suíços, ingleses, franceses e outros dirigiram-se para o sul da Bahia. Os suíços, desde o início do século XIX, desempenharam papéis marcantes na história da região. Uma das principais referências é o naturalista, uma das primeiras referências, é o naturalista ornitólogo Georg Freyreis, na viagem ao Brasil com o príncipe Maximiliano de Wildberger. Como membro da colônia Leopoldina, ele volta 3 anos depois para uma experiência de colonização promovida pela coroa portuguesa. Segundo Marcelo Dias, a vila de Ilhéus apresentou algum crescimento demográfico por volta do período da independência do Brasil, em 1822, mas não se especializou em nenhuma lavoura específica. Comercializava madeiras e produzia principalmente farinha, arroz e açúcar. Outro tipo de inserção na região que atraiu o interesse dos suíços foi a aquisição particular de terras destinada à agricultura voltada ao mercado externo. Um exemplo foi o Fernand Steiger, que adquiriu uma fazenda próxima ao porto de Ilhéus, dedicou-se à produção de café, açúcar e cacau, além de possuir o maior plantel de escravizados na Bahia, do sul da Bahia. Steiger também participou, juntamente com comerciantes e produtores locais, da oferta de crédito para o financiamento da produção do cacau a grandes e pequenos lavradores. A escassez de crédito nesse restrito ambiente de negócios foi um grande entrave econômico que abriu espaço para a entrada de capitais estrangeiros. A abolição da escravidão em 1888 encerrou a sociedade estamental e inaugurou a sociedade de classes no Brasil. No sul da Bahia, o fim da escravidão coincidiu com o bom desempenho da lavoura cacaueira, cultura que, comparada a outras, exigia menos volume de investimentos e mão de obra, estabelecendo um vetor de consolidação econômica nas décadas seguintes. Após a abolição, a sociedade regional se reconfigurou sob a hegemonia de uma classe vinculada à produção e exportação do cacau. Essa classe subdividia-se em 2 frações facilmente identificáveis: a comercial exportadora e a agrária produtora, que, apesar de suas disputas e especificidades, mantiveram posição hegemônica em relação à classe trabalhadora formada no pós-abolição. A classe trabalhadora era composta, sobretudo, por trabalhadores rurais assalariados, meeiros, terceiros e uma variedade de trabalhadores urbanos ligados aos setores de comércio, transportes e serviços, todos eles orbitando ao redor da cadeia produtiva do cacau. Outra forma de inserção do suíço na região foi a criação de empresas comerciais exportadoras, que posteriormente passaram também à produção de cacau, destacando-se a Carlos Keller e Cia, a Wildberger e Cia e a Kaufmann e Cia, no século XX. Pelo volume negociado, pela sua atuação do financiamento da produção, essas casas comerciais impulsionaram a cacauicultura a um novo patamar no processo de acumulação de capitais. A historiografia sobre a região, produzida a partir do final da década de 1970, com destaque para Angelina Garcês, Antônio Guerreira de Freitas e Gustavo Falcon, analisou a formação da monocultura cacaueira e identificou o período a partir de 1890 como de expansão contínua, tendência que se manteve até 1928, às vésperas da crise mundial de 1929. A obra da historiadora Maureen Marrone teve impacto decisivo na história e historiografia da região, ao situar a utilização da mão de obra escravizada na implantação da monocultura do cacau, modificando interpretações, inclusive sobre a abolição e o pós-abolição. Marrone também inaugurou os estudos históricos sobre as relações transatlânticas do cacau. Por meio do conceito de cadeia de commodities, a autora discute as conexões do sul da Bahia com o mercado consumidor externo, os padrões de gosto e os fatores políticos, produtivos, técnicos e tecnológicos que contribuíram para a inserção e valorização do produto no comércio internacional. No sul da Bahia, o declínio e o fim da escravidão foram um período de deslocamentos e migrações. Parte dos homens e mulheres escravizados abandonaram as terras dos senhores para habitar no entorno das fazendas, nas cidades ou em regiões distantes. A região sul da Bahia atraiu libertos e trabalhadores livres que saíram das terras dos senhores de outras regiões da Bahia e contingente de pessoas que chegaram pelo mar, vindos de Sergipe, Alagoas e Ceará, são estados vizinhos da Bahia. Entre os segmentos de diferentes origens, havia um traço em comum: uma população majoritariamente negra, em busca de sobrevivência, melhores condições de vida e de terras. No pós-abolição, o fator decisivo para a manutenção das desigualdades foi a disputa pela propriedade das terras. Até o final do século XIX, a ocupação das terras no sul da Bahia foi caracterizada pela presença de pequenas propriedades de cacau, substituída por um processo constante, crescente e constante de concentração fundiária no século XX. Essa concentração resultou na expulsão dos pequenos produtores de cacau das suas terras que possuíam e na exploração de inúmeros pequenos produtores que cultivavam o produto em terras de terceiros, com quem dividiam os lucros. Muitos desses pequenos produtores trabalhadores, foram expulsos das terras por meio de violência física, de endividamento ou de entraves à regularização fundiária. O trabalho assalariado foi disseminado de forma lenta e desigual. Os trabalhadores urbanos conquistaram direito a um salário mínimo em 1940 e os trabalhadores rurais apenas em 1963, após as lutas da classe trabalhadora. Questões relevantes permanecem pouco exploradas. Quais os significados da empresa Wildberger e Cia pagar salário mínimo a seus trabalhadores na década de 20 e 30, fato incomum entre produtores e empregadores locais? Quais foram as implicações da manutenção, até meados da década de 1930, do sistema de barracão? Os barracões eram armazéns da fazenda de cacau, onde eram vendidos aos trabalhadores produtos de consumo básico e a preços exorbitantes, que, quando descontados do período trabalhado, resultavam em dívidas e situação e condições análogas ao trabalho escravo. Quais os impactos do racismo na formação das classes trabalhadoras do sul da Bahia? O cacau continua sendo a principal cultura agrícola de Ilhéus. Atualmente, a Bahia é responsável por cerca de 90% do processamento inicial do cacau no Brasil, que se realiza majoritariamente em Ilhéus. Destaca-se a fundação, em 1996, nessa cidade, na cidade de Ilhéus, da indústria moageira suíça Barrica Libu, com sede em Zurique. Importante perguntar quais as relações entre a economia e o novo padrão do gosto que demanda cacau especial, designado cacau fino. Reforça a necessidade do avanço das pesquisas sobre as contradições sociais e trabalhistas na região cacaueira. Pesquisa realizada entre 2017 e 2018 pela Organização Internacional do Trabalho, em parceria com o Ministério Público do Trabalho, revelou o resgate em Ilhéus de trabalhadores que viviam em condições degradantes de moradia, sem acesso à água potável, energia elétrica ou saneamento básico, submetidos a sistemas de dívidas e coerções, através de contratos de parceria que ocultavam vínculos empregatícios e impunham a subordinação econômica. Ressalta a importância da continuidade de pesquisas sobre as conexões entre o Brasil e a Suíça nos séculos 20 e 21 e parabeniza os autores que estão se dedicando a produzir uma historiografia plural e conectada das relações atlânticas entre Brasil e Suíça nas pessoas cujos trabalhos conheci recentemente: Bernard Char, Isabel Barros, Michael Schmitz, André Lima, Beatrice Verrassá e Beatrice Ziegler. Muito obrigada pela atenção. Eu vou primeiro, antes de descer, vou passar alguns slides, mas só sem muito tempo, que eu sei que eu já passei no meu, mas vamos lá. Essa é uma imagem de Ilhéus, feita pelo príncipe, no período da viagem do príncipe Maximiliano de Villeneuve, então, 1821. Né? Aqui, essa imagem do porto, eu gosto muito dela, apesar dela estar tão ruinzinha, mas é a única que nós temos na história. Esse é o antigo porto de Ilhéus. Olha como é que ficavam as sacas. Olha a precariedade do que significava esse porto no início do século. As sacas ali, canoas era que transportavam as sacas de cacau para os navios. A ferrovia, ela tinha esse traçado, passando, inclusive, por Ferradas, que era o ponto que um mapa parecido com o que ela mostrou, que onde passava, era o caminho que ela faria, ela percorreria toda essa extensão até a Vitória da Conquista, mas ela só chega, é uma ferrovia inglesa, ela só chega a esse tracejadozinho preto e branco que vocês estão vendo aí, bastante pequenininho. No entanto, foi uma das ferrovias mais lucrativas do país. Esse já é o porto, no momento em que você já tem cais construídos, já tem galpões. E aqui vocês podem ver os vagões da estrada de ferro, indo direto ali para o porto. Então, os ingleses que fizeram a ferrovia iam até o porto, até o cais, para fazer o carregamento dos navios. Então, os ingleses hegemonizavam o porto de Ilhéus. Aqui é a sede do Wildberger em Ilhéus, que a sede mesmo era no Porto de Salvador. Esse homem que eu acabei não podendo falar por causa do tempo, mas é o Hugo Kaufmann, um suíço muito importante na história da nossa região. Ele vai ser o primeiro. Então, aqui à frente, vocês veem o galpão dele, né, no Porto de Ilhéus. E aqui, imagem dentro da fábrica de chocolate. Ele foi o primeiro a construir uma fábrica de chocolate em Ilhéus, que não deu certo. Certo? Passou pouco tempo e faliu. E como vocês veem, os trabalhadores negros no interior da fábrica. Aqui é no dia de hoje, essa é a Barrica Libu, a saída da Barrica Libu da fábrica, moageira. Hoje ela é uma multinacional de uma fusão francesa e belga, que a gente está tentando compreender, e que tem sede em Zurique. E aqui a situação dos trabalhadores do cacau até os dias de hoje. Essa foi uma denúncia de trabalho escravo, é o resgate desse senhor que morava nessas condições que vocês estão vendo aí. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Kátia. And now we move on for the last presentation. In this last presentation, we will continue to explore the Swiss community in Brazil and its economic impact with Béatrice Ziegler presentation, Brazilian import, substitution, industrialization, and Swiss immigration control. Silk ribbon waivers for from Basel for silk spinning mills in Brazil, 1912 to 1930. Béatrice Ziegler, for those who didn't come to the Salon Historique last Wednesday, it's a retired historian living in Bern. She worked at the University of Zurich, at the University of Applied Sciences and Arts, Northwestern Switzerland, and at the Center of Democracy, Aarau. Her research fields include subjects like migration history, gender history, the Swiss history of the 19th to the 20th century, subjects that Professor Ziegler developed on her PhD thesis at the University of Zurich about the question of the Swiss immigrants in the coffee plantations of São Paulo between 1852 to 1866. Béatrice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for Bernhard and Isabel to have invited me. And with the subject a little bit different from the rest of them, because I won't speak about slavery. I will speak about a subject in the beginning of the 20th century, and with a perspective entirely Swiss, because of due to the documents. I'll start. First, the surface. Between autumn 1912 and January 1913, around 30 workers from the Basel silk ribbon industry left Switzerland for Brazil. Besides, many of them were women. They followed a small group of workers who had already emigrated, about whom no further information is available. The silk ribbon company, Ziegler and Company, where they had been employed until then, did not agree with this exodus of workers. The employees of the Basel silk ribbon weaving industry were considered skilled workers on whom the quality and quantity of the silk ribbon produced depended, in addition to the appropriate machines. Okay?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe it's... Sorry, Beatrice.
Yeah, it's okay.
Better?
Yeah, I think so. It's okay. In its opposition to the immigration, the company invoked Swiss legislation, Emigration, control from the 1880s. The company was arguing that this constituted illegal recruitment, as there had been contact with the industrialists in Brazil promising work, intermediaries in Basel, and those wishing to emigrate, which was forbidden. Additionally, Ziegler and Company placed this event in the context of industrial relocation, which would threaten the existence of industry in Basel. Basel's silk ribbon weaving industry had enjoyed worldwide renown for centuries and dominated the economy of the Basel region, but it had passed its peak clearly by the beginning of the 20th century. Working conditions deteriorated steadily, both for whom weavers and for factory workers. They did not keep pace with the improving working conditions in other industries. Reasons for the creeping and growing crisis were changing fashion trends, competition by other centers, especially newcoming USA, rising prices of raw materials, and last but not least, the competition from artificial silk. Little is known about the establishment of silkworm breeding, silk thread production, and silk fabric manufacturing in Brazil. The literature I am familiar with comes mainly from biologists and agricultural scientists who comment on the general conditions of breeding and combating disease problems in silkworms. A few texts mention that the central government attempted to establish silk production in the country at the beginning of the 20th century. To this end, it issued a decree in 1912 with the aim of supporting silkworm breeding, in particular through research. Unfortunately, I do not have any further details about this decree at this time. The central government's 1912 initiatives to support silkworm breeding and silk production is mentioned in some articles, but it has not really been investigated. However, it is important for the history discussed here, as it can be assumed that the enterprises to which the Basel workers emigrated were stimulated by this official initiative. As will become apparent below, silk thread and fabric factories emerged in the context of the cotton textile industry, in our case of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The cotton industry there is considered one of the industries that initiated and promoted import substitution industrialization. Entrepreneurs, technicians, and industrial equipment, especially spinning and weaving machines, came from Europe and the United States, while slaves and immigrant workers were initially used both in plantations and industrial enterprises. As the industry developed and began to produce finer cotton fabrics, entrepreneurs sought of more skilled and qualified workers. The capital for these ventures came largely from the plantation aristocracy, who were looking for new investment opportunities in the aftermath of abolition. In this diverse industrial environment, a few silk and silk ribbon production facilities were established. One of the most important cotton manufacturing sites at the time was the Carioba Company in Villa Americana, which owned cotton spinning and weaving mills, a highly efficient power station, and large tracts of land. This is important for our case, as it was a director of Swiss origin at the important Carioba cotton mills in Villa Americana named Kiefer, and a chief engineer named Niederhauser, who opened a silk weaving mill on the premises there and at the same time planned their own in Barra do Piraí in the state of Rio de Janeiro. They promised employment to workers in Basel who were willing to emigrate. What materials is my narrative based on? It's initially grounded in historical international migration research, takes into account the theory and history of import substitution industrialization in Latin American countries, and incorporates the concept of knowledge circulation. Look, orange boxes. Historical research on the Basel silk ribbon industry, on the textile industry in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil in general, as well as sparse research on the Brazilian silk industry, and only one work on international silk production and trade, see blue back boxes, substantiate these fundamentals. The focus lies on just 13 documents from the Swiss Emigration Office, here yellow boxes. The 13 documents illustrate how the Federal Emigration Office attempted to clarify whether laws had been violated in the recruitment of workers for Brazilian silk ribbon factories. It conducted its own investigations and commissioned the Basel Police Department to carry out inquiries that could potentially lead to legal proceedings. This material enables to construct the traces of the case of the immigration of silk ribbon weavers from Basel to Brazil which can be interpreted firstly as part of an industrial relocation in the context of import substitution industrialization in Brazil. Secondly, as the circulation of knowledge, in which the ribbon weavers are regarded as bearers of specific expertise. Or thirdly, as a case of emigration of skilled workers in search of a better life. What happened? The files of the Federal Immigration Office on the emigration of silk ribbon workers in 1912-13 mentioned that the Mr. A. Kiefer had already recruited several textile workers for a company called Müller, Albert and Company during his stay in Basel in 1911. The company belonged to the Carioba complex. For those who emigrated in 1912-13, Fritz Mumenthaler told the Basel police that his son was the director of the Müller, Albert and Company factory and had written to him asking him to ensure that around 8 silk weavers came to work for him. An employee of the Basel Seiler and Company named Schweitzer decided to emigrate and persuaded silk weavers to emigrate with him. The available literature does not mention a silk ribbon factory in Barra do Piraí in the state of Rio de Janeiro. However, the files on the emigration of the silk ribbon weavers report that such a factory was established. Daniel Sassi Borlin, an authorized signatory at the Chemische Industriegesellschaft in Basel, who according to police questioning was a friend of Kiefer's, stated that in 1911 Kiefer was still working for the company Müller, Albert and Company, but then left to the company with Mr. Niederhauser, the technical director of the factory, to found a new silk ribbon weaving mill in Barra do Piraí. Niederhauser's mother stated that he was Kiefer's partner in the silk ribbon weaving mill in Barra do Piraí. The Basel-based silk ribbon manufacturer Ziegler and Company, which was affected by the exodus of workers, seemed to recognize Swiss immigration legislation as a legal means of preventing what it considered to be poaching of workers. Since the 1880s, any recruitment of individuals or groups for so-called colonization enterprise had been subject to authorization, whereby a craft or industrial enterprise could also be considered as such under certain circumstances. In addition, it was forbidden to advance money to those wishing to emigrate, as the aim was to prevent them from starting their new life abroad in debt. These were the basis for the Immigration Office's approach. The head of the Immigration Office, Jakob Möhr, took immediate action after learning of the recent emigration. For him, it was essential to clarify 2 issues. Firstly, he investigated the actions of the immigration agencies involved, Rammel and Company and Naturel Le Coultre and Company. He concluded that the agencies should have reported the transport of the textile workers to the Immigration Office and that they should not have contacted the entrepreneurs in Brazil. He came to the conclusion that their actions had violated legal requirements. The Federal Department of Political Affairs subsequently issued a warning and threatened to revoke their licenses in the event of a repeated offense. Secondly, Möhr instructed the Basel Stadt Police Department to investigate whether the private individuals involved in Basel, Daniel Sassi Borlin, Fritz Mumenthaler, and Lisette Niederhauser-Schürch, were guilty of any wrongdoing. In the case of Lisette Niederhauser and Fritz Mumenthaler, the question was whether they had engaged in unauthorized recruitment of people wishing to emigrate. Daniel Sassi Borlin had also issued the bills of exchange for the persons he had recruited so that they could pay for the crossing, and invoiced his friend Kiefer for this amount. Niederhauser and Mumenthaler stated in court that the silk ribbon weavers had been contacted directly by the factory owners, and that those who had already emigrated in 1911 had provided them with information, that is about wages and working conditions. Sassi Borlin confirmed that he had issued the bills of exchange, but maintained that those wishing to emigrate had come to him and of their own accord. According to the newspaper report on the court hearing, the judges sought fines for Daniel Sassi Borlin and Fritz Mumenthaler, while Lisette Niederhauser-Schürch was to be acquitted. The Basel Stadt Police Court acquitted all three defendants without further explanation. This exhausts the files of the Emigration Office, and the traces of the emigrants are lost, at least for the time being. It's no exaggeration to say that the head of the Federal Immigration Office overzealously classified a natural exchange between family members and acquaintances, namely conversations and information about job opportunities in the silk ribbon factories of relatives and former colleagues in Brazil, as a violation of immigration law. However, his actions can also be interpreted as a consequence of the fact that, as the Nationalzeitung noted in its court report, Basel's industrialists in silk ribbon industry had been complaining for some time that numerous workers were leaving their jobs without notice, in some cases leaving debts behind in order to emigrate to Brazil and take up employment in factories in some industry there. This raises the suspicion that representatives of the Basel silk ribbon industry attempted to use immigration legislation to harm their emerging competitors in Brazil by trying to prevent silk ribbon weavers from emigrating and thus prevent the transfer of specialist knowledge. Thank you for your attention. I would have some questions for you then later.
So now I open the floor for questions.
Two microphones, they don't work together.
No. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Monique. No, I have to go this way.
Thank you so much for these really interesting and fascinating presentations. I think first of all, I have one very small question for Béatrice Ziegler, because I am interested in insects. So I was wondering if you also found cases of entomologists from Switzerland who emigrated to kind of in the context of the silk industry. Yeah, but maybe not, but just out of my own interest. And then I have also a very small question for Michael, which relates to this thing you said about the medical care that was established for the workers. And this is, I think, as you said, this is very typical for the time, kind of this philanthropy after the abolition of slavery in the context of indentured labor. And I'm always a bit unhappy with just accepting this narrative of philanthropy. What would you argue, was there also an economic rationale behind establishing medical care, behind establishing schools? I mean, especially considering that disease, for example, also meant like a loss of profits, potentially. So, yeah, but that's all. from my side. Thank you so much.
Getting there. Works. Thank you. That's okay.
Other questions?
Oh yeah, well there are. Okay. Well, outside this road. That's good. So Yuki and then Tom and Harvey. So.
Okay. Thank you to the panel. I have an extremely broad question, very broad question. And this question is also relevant, I think, to the panel from yesterday, the trade and finance. Andres, Ricardo, and Alain. So maybe we can talk about it more later. So this is my broad question. Oh, it's for everyone. That's why it's very broad. I try to ask questions. I try to ask connecting broad questions. So I've learned a lot from this conference about, English is okay, right? Sorry, earlier I thought I was speaking in English and I realized later I was speaking in Portuguese, so I'm getting confused. So my question was this, from yesterday's panel, Trade and Finance, and today's panel, I'm learning a lot about like Swiss firms, Swiss families, and their enterprises in Brazil, especially south of Bahia, Ilhéus, and now through ISI, and I kind of like the historical trajectory. But I keep on thinking, right, so you guys are talking about the global history of capitalism, right? And so much capitalism and slavery scholarship, the history of global capitalism. And, I who come from the US Academy, so much of that conversation is, most people are US based and they're mostly talking maybe in global history of cotton, but mostly they're talking about the US South and Manchester. Like they don't really leave that sphere. Or maybe they talk about Cuban sugar a little bit. Maybe they talk about Brazilian coffee and cotton, but it's always in relation to the US and to Manchester. That's their only circuit. And I feel like this scholarship that you guys have talked about has really kind of given a different perspective, right? Because through these kind of Swiss firms and Swiss circulation of finance and capital, et cetera. And I was just wondering if you could say a little more, because in a way, these are micro histories about a single company or a single family or a single firm, but I feel like you can make a broader claim. And this maybe is helpful for you who are writing your dissertation, right? You always want to make the bigger claim. So I was wondering, and Kátia and everyone who's working also in Ilhéus, and this is so important, to kind of insert your research into that broader conversation. Because I, as a Brazilianist in the United States, I'm always so frustrated by how narrow these conversations are geographically and also otherwise. So I was wondering if you guys could maybe speak to more of that scholarship and how you think your research can contribute to the history of capitalism. Sorry, I told you it was a broad question.
It will be a much more narrow question. And it's, I'm sorry, it's for Michael. It's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your PhD. I have two questions. The first one, at one point, and for me, it was not clear, you mentioned the layman, and it's very interesting because they become, for me, I saw they made the headlines very recently, in financing the transfer to Nobel Prize from Harvard to Zurich. And so I was wondering how they were connected, if it's them, no? And the second question is, it seems that in one sense, your story is a story of a failure after 1940, and I was wondering, because at the same time there are very famous, Swiss free trade companies which are very famous around the world and so on, Lealer's book and so on. So I was wondering why the firm you are looking at is not able to go, a step further in comparison with other of such. Is it because Yeni was in Paris and not in Switzerland, and so on? So I would like to know what the failure of your company could shed a light on the success of other, freestanding companies in Switzerland at the same time.
And maybe you can answer this first round of questions.
I will shortly sim, a contribuição das nossas temáticas Okay. So for the first question of like if there can be an economical question behind establishing schools and medical aid. Well, in the sources, I don't find this. I think what I really very clearly find is the political motivation. Like this is a foreign export company, but despite being so many decades established in Bahia, it is still basically a foreign company who is taking over more than 100 fazendas of cacao in a moment of crisis, and a nationalist government. So they were really, they were like, it was scattered all around the south of Bahia, these fazendas. So they were saying, oh, we heard that this administration isn't implementing minimum wage anymore. So tell him he has to really do this. So, and the schools is also one of the few moments that they want to have the light of the press. Normally they really avoid like publicity, but in this moment they really went, okay, they should really tell about these schools. So I think the main motivation was really political, not to give any reason to attack them.
For this question, I could make a contribution too, but because there's a long tradition of such so-called philanthropy in Europe too, in Switzerland too. Many industrialists had opened schools, made insurance possibilities and so on, because they had a problem that in the region where they were established, they had to be attractive for workers. So they tried to fix the workers with some special facilities. And the same case is in Brazil, is seen in Brazil, for example, in Carioba. There was the same politics for to fix the workers, because it was far away from the cities, and the Italian immigrants, which they would like to use as laborers, they stayed in the cities and found jobs there, so they had to attract them with something special, and they founded villages to lodge them, and made sports facilities and schools and the church and many things like this to attract them simply. So this is not really philanthropy, but tactics. Yeah. To your first question of the entomologists, no, I don't know. Absolutely no. But you have to see that the speech I made now was based really on 13 documents of Swiss emigration.
A contribuição, pelo que eu não ouvi em inglês, mas eu vou fazer uma abordagem geral. Primeiro, porque eu acho que a gente precisa sempre compreender melhor o capitalismo, porque ele nos atravessa como um monstro cheio de tentáculos e que a gente muitas vezes não percebe que, como somos envolvidos nesses tentáculos, né? Uma das coisas na história do Brasil que se dizia antes era que o capitalismo não convivia com a escravidão, por isso a escravidão teve que acabar. Isso é a maior falácia. Depois, as gerações de historiadores mostraram que não, que o capitalismo ele vai conviver com absolutamente qualquer forma de organização do trabalho e de exploração do ser humano. Então, assim, e em Ilhéus, especialmente, eu acho que a gente tem muito a contribuir, porque Brodel fala que toda a história de um lugar é história regional, todas as histórias são regionais. E essa nossa região, ela tem umas especificidades que são impressionantes. Assim, os ingleses conseguiram em Ilhéus o que não conseguiram no resto do Brasil. Eles tentaram dominar porto e ferrovia. Só conseguiram isso em Ilhéus. Em São Paulo não conseguiram, no Rio, nenhum dos lugares onde eles tentaram. Sempre havia uma disputa maior, pois lá em Ilhéus eles conseguiram hegemonizar todo esse processo. Mas eles estavam em decadência, né, já no início do século, já sendo transferida essa dominância para os Estados Unidos. E aí acontece outra coisa impressionante em Ilhéus, é a presença dos suíços. Eu estava pensando, a partir da pergunta do Bernard, que começou esse evento, que me fez pensar muita coisa esses dias, assim, por que levou tanto tempo, né? E uma das coisas que eu acho é impressionante como os suíços, nas nossas histórias lá da região, sempre passaram meio que despercebidos. E sendo tão estruturantes, tão importantes, que mudaram todo o padrão de produção da nossa região, né? Então, uma efetividade imensa. E o que eu pensei muito para esse momento aqui era essa longevidade e as formas, que é como se fosse um aprendizado de dominação. Primeiro vem nas visitas, depois compra terra, produz o que tem, cacau, até que chega no cacau. No cacau, eles já estão elaborando as relações de comércio. Então, é um momento também de construção. Então, primeiro, sociedade em comandita, depois vem as sociedades anônimas, e a gente chega na Barrica Libu, que é uma das maiores multinacionais do mundo, aí, acho que são 13 países, e que eu fico pensando, por exemplo, como é que é a relação de África nisso? Assim, a competição pelo cacau, porque assim, a gente vive lá na região uma situação onde os cacauicultores ficam rezando para a África entrar e ter problemas na produção do cacau, e os africanos idem. Como essas dissemelhanças, essas assimetrias vão sendo geradas dentro desse processo capitalista, né? Então, eu acho que agora realmente a gente tem a limitação dos acervos, agora a gente está conseguindo, através de um grupo como esse, vencer essas barreiras, e bom, é isso. Então, eu acho que a gente contribui muito, sim, para entender, e porque nós somos lá na região atravessados o tempo inteiro por essas crises do capital, por todos esses problemas, por toda essa manipulação. Deixa eu só concluir uma coisa. Desculpem, eu sou asmática e estou com um pouco de falta de ar. Só um minuto. Vai voltar. Eu acho que eu vou beber um pouco de água. Assim, acho que o clima mais seco também, para mim, é um pouco difícil. Bom, uma das coisas, por exemplo, que interessa muito no meu projeto agora é entender a manipulação dos preços do cacau. Enquanto o café, no Brasil, foi uma cultura muito protegida, inclusive dentro do país, mas fora também, que isso é uma coisa que a gente levou muito tempo para saber, né? Então, os estoques eram feitos fora do café para não permitir que baixasse os preços. Mas o cacau viveu assim, vale e montanha. Então, assim, foi muito difícil. E dentro dessa questão dos preços, a historiografia da região, ela questiona muito a atuação dessas casas exportadoras. E até hoje isso não está trabalhado ou, melhor, interpretado pelos historiadores. Então, bom, é isso. Agradeço.
Posso? Okay. Yeah, maybe I can just continue with this point, because I think this is something that I see contributing maybe to a broader history of capitalism, that I see on one hand, that it's very local, regional, this, as I showed briefly in the beginning, markets and social, cultural constructions that you need to establish. You had to integrate into coronelismo to get this cacao. And on the other hand, it's really very global. So it really doesn't matter that Wildberger is Swiss and Switzerland has a big chocolate industry. So if the market conditions are better for Wildberger to sell in the US, he will sell in the US. And if, on the other hand, for the Swiss chocolate industry, it was more convenient to get cacao from the Gold Coast. So this is really the global laws, and there I think it's also important to really put this role of the exporters in this global context to see that they were, like in Bahia, they were very powerful, but globally they were not able to control markets or prices. So it was really a gamble. It's reading this correspondence, it looks very stressing. I wouldn't want to do this job. Yes, and I think the other thing is really, as you mentioned, like these other actors that normally are emphasized, like, so yeah, to put in the front line actors like Swiss actors, like maybe in the tradition of the trans-imperial history, which is looking at like putting these actors of nations who were not the big imperial powers, how they could navigate imperial constellations and maybe also take advantage from a specific position. So I think that there is something about it also in the case of Wildberger. Can I continue with the, okay. Good. Yeah, I think it's also connected then to the last question, why did Wildberger not get... I was also, when I was reading De Jong's book about Volkart, I was also reading, questioning myself, why didn't Wildberger transform into a global commodity firm? Or, but basically they would have had to really merge Wildberger and Keller. And Wildberger, as I told, he was Bahia. I mean, the European field was for Keller. And Keller was then transforming himself into a global capitalist who was crucial for the establishment of the Swiss machine industry in Brazil, establishing the Schweizerische Handelsindustriegesellschaft, like Swiss Commerce Society and Industry Society for Brazil. So I think he had also like other plans with his capital. For me, this is basically the explanation that Wildberger had other interests also, Keller, sorry. Also Wildberger already after World War I, he wants to found a Sociedade Anonyma, it's a limited stock company, and not a commodity company, how it was. But Keller always gets his veto because basically they had good profits always from Wildberger without getting more involved and without like having the danger of losing this position. Yes. And then there was about Lehmann, the connection. Basically, I mean, it's after my time frame, but it's clear that, Paul Lehmann was a cheese merchant from Emmental who, as it is told by the family, like for economic reasons, he emigrated to Brazil. There he worked as a director of Bali, the shoe factory. So he was not really, he had maybe you could say a middle class position. And then they get a share of these plantations also. When this big plantation company of Wildberger is dissolved, they get a share of these plantations, and Jorge Paulo Lehmann is the representative of the Lehmann family in this process. So I can't put it quantitatively, but it's for me it seems obvious that like capital and maybe the networks to a bigger business that they come from Wildberger. Of course, then it's a whole different story what Jorge Paulo Lehmann made, but there is this connection. He comes from this network.
I would like to try to say something about this global perspective and the concentration on Swiss emigration and Swiss immigrants and the Swiss participation in Brazil. I think it's not so easy. Surely you may have the idea to develop a broad picture of capitalism, of slavery in the world, and so on. But there are other interests too, which are important for researchers and for people, ordinary people. So in respect to Swiss researchers, it is quite important and politically important to develop a view on Swiss participation in this global process. And if you want to do that, you have to develop the case studies, to look after singular figures and their participation in the development of economy, of transnational processes, and so on. And I understand this conference as a possibility to exactly follow this political interest, and its political interest to situate this international entanglement of Switzerland in order to change something, change views in Switzerland itself. So I agree totally that one doesn't have to limit oneself to a nation or whatever. But in this case, it's extremely important that we look for Swiss entanglement in the world.
Does someone feel unanswered?
Yeah. Okay, Isabel.
Hey, thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions. And maybe I'm going to extrapolate a little bit. I feel your research, Michael and André, very similar, because you go from the 19th century, like from the Porchat family, how they arrive in Brazil, then Wildberger, like Michael was transcribing my documents with from Mai, from Current Dutch. Thank you so much, Michael, for doing that. And Yetzler Rico, they are already there. So they are there from the 19th century, and we see that, as Kátia put it so well, you see the longevity of those presences and those networks and how they stay. And what André showed us yesterday that I was really amazed by is like how you have as well, like we have this idea that in Brazil we have the operary movement that's wide, it's European and so on. And we see that it's not the case in São Paulo, like in Santos and in the Porchat industries. So I would like to know if you see as well, I know that you didn't see that probably yet in your sources, but I would as well like to address this question to Kátia. Like if you see like an operary, like an organization movement from those descendants of enslaved people or indigenous people to try to balance these abusive situations. And I think, Thomas, it would be nice to do a Observatoire des élites suisses number 2, volume 2, Brazil. Maybe it would be a good idea. And yeah, that would be that. And I think, Béatrice, thank you so much for your contribution. I think you have a lot to contribute still. Doesn't seem that you finish your career with the Swiss-Brazilian history.
Other questions? No? Oh, Bernard.
Yes, thanks. I just have a very small one, and it's following up on discussions that we already had, and I would like to address it to Kátia, but I have it to also others in the room, because Kátia, I was very impressed. So you were talking about, I mean, it's an arrival of Europeans from many different regions. You talk about Swedish, the Swiss, the Germans, and many others. So I was wondering, for your research that you are doing, I mean, it's a very banal question, you know. Is there anything? Is the Swissness, the category of Swiss, is that at all relevant for you, or would you be more comfortable just talking about Europeans coming? Or put it differently, I mean, are the Swiss there behaving any differently than the Germans or the British or the French, from what you see in your? Because I mean, from here in Switzerland, and it's, yeah, Béatrice pointed out, for us politically, it's extremely important to have this national category. Switzerland has a history in Brazil, but I'm wondering, maybe for you it's not that relevant. That's my question, Kátia. Thank you.
Eu vou começar pelo fim e depois eu vou para a pergunta de Isabel. Sim, me interessa demais. Me interessam, na verdade, compreender a trajetória dos ingleses entre nós e a substituição pela hegemonia americana, que eu acho que o fato de sermos parte do estado da Bahia, Nordeste, a gente entrou muito em desvantagem no início da República, como todos os benefícios econômicos foram carreados para o Sul, para Rio, São Paulo e Sul do Brasil, e isso traz um racismo também nisso aí, né? Então, nós ficamos com essa região que ficou à mercê dos capitais estrangeiros e das estratégias de estrangeiros. Os ingleses fizeram ferrovia porque interessava levar o cacau rapidamente para o porto. Os suecos chegaram numa aliança com os americanos, que tinham vantagens em todos os portos onde eles chegavam, as mesmas vantagens dos americanos, e levavam o cacau para os Estados Unidos. Os suecos, mesmo com os navios encalhando, eles continuavam mandando buscar o cacau, né, para levar para os Estados Unidos. Então, assim, mas os suíços têm para nós uma importância muito maior, porque eles ficaram. Os suecos não, os ingleses não, mas os suíços permaneceram. Então, sempre me impressionou no meu trabalho essa longevidade da permanência e as modalidades, e até hoje está lá, né? Assim, o que isso tem a ver com as crises que passamos, com a história do trabalho, como eu estava falando, porque eu sempre falo para Michael, no início, o salário mínimo só foi pago em 1940. Ele já pagava lá no início. O que significava para as pessoas receber esse salário? E aí eu respondo um pouco essa pergunta. Isso foi um momento, foi uma coisa de disputa pelas relações de lutas entre os trabalhadores na região, Isabel. Assim, você teve as lutas dos trabalhadores dessas casas, dos operários, dos públicos, dos funcionários públicos que vieram com a ferrovia, e com esses trabalhadores. Então, assim, isso tinha a ver, porque todo mundo queria essa garantia do salário que acontecia nas fazendas do Wildberger, e que os outros não tinham, né? A gente tem movimentos de resistência todo o tempo, desde o Steiger. Os escravos do Steiger, em maioria, eles abandonaram a fazenda antes da abolição. Um ano antes, eles já estavam abandonando. Quer dizer, então, você tem uma população muito pobre, muito discriminada, muito oprimida, e que até hoje continua lá lutando por direitos básicos, pelo pagamento do salário, que isso é uma coisa rara, pelas garantias dos direitos. Os processos são inúmeros, há uma resistência cotidiana muito grande nisso. E os indígenas, eles são, como é que eu vou dizer, eles são considerados, me lembrei já caboclos. Os caboclos são misturados aí, tidos como misturados com trabalhadores que estão imiscuídos aí nessas relações de trabalho também, né? Então, são movimentos que acontecem a todo tempo, a resistência, e as garantias vão sendo conquistadas, né? Agora, o movimento indígena está numa briga muito grande pela terra. Então, eles estão fechados dentro das disputas das terras. E os trabalhadores continuam. Hoje tem uma evasão muito grande do trabalhador do campo. Os proprietários estão com os cabelos na mão, porque não estão conseguindo trabalhadores, pelos salários que eles pagam, pelas condições que eles propiciam. Então, assim, tem uma resistência muito grande do trabalho rural hoje em dia, por exemplo. E isso é uma resistência.
I just want to add a short thing. There is interesting research about the communist movement in the south of Bahia from Marcelo Lins, also from the West. And in the sources of Wildberger's plantation company, I see also some examples of workers' agencies when, for example, the administrator says, I had to raise the wages because else the workers threatened to leave because the neighbor plantation owner also raised the wages, or when there is labor shortage, when the Bahia Cacao Institute starts to construct roads, he says, oh, now they pay better, so we have a bit of a problem. So I'm happy to have these sources where the workers' agencies also is appearing. So yes, I think that's it.
I think we can conclude. So, thank you very much, Michael, Kátia, and Béatrice. It was a very instructive panel. Thank you for your questions. See you after lunch for the very last panel. Let me see the name. Legacies of Slavery and Memory Cultures, 20th Century, in which Aline Martel will take my place. Bon appetit.